As a longtime player, I could tell you that Star Trek Online is going through a bit of a renaissance in 2026. The old developers came back. It seems like the game is finally out of maintenance mode. The most recent update is the best content we've had in the past 5 years, easily, and they keep talking up 2027 as the year they really start their new development. This is just the warm-up. I'm really happy with the direction of the game. For the first time in a long time, I feel like the game has a future. I want to ensure that that future is as bright as possible. So I'd like to address an issue that has been a sticking point with the community for as long as the game has been around: Omni Beam equip limits. I want to dive into why they are a problem, what needs to be done to fix it, and my takeaways as to how to implement the fixes. The first problem has to do with how item sets are set up. If you're unaware, an item set is a group of items that need to be equipped to provide additional bonuses. There's over 15, well, at least 15 sets that need an Omni Beam. And currently, the Omni Beam equip limit prevents you from equipping more than one of these sets. Now, this would not be a big problem, but turrets have no such restriction. So when you build a beam build, you really feel that limit, and it's quite painful. I think this is the primary reason players don't like the Omni limit. The game design constantly puts you at odds with the limit because you're trying to build around these item sets. Additionally, set Omnis are quite a bit weaker than normal Omnis. In fact, a certain group of them, called support beam arrays, are even weaker than a turret, and yet they are still subject to the one equip limit. The second problem has to do with aft weapon slots. Now, the ship on screen is the Vorgan Yeet-Jara, which is the only ship in the game to have a 3-5 weapons layout. I want you to think about how you would best build that ship for damage. We're going to come back to this later. Now, part of the problem is that outside of mine builds, which are largely a joke and not very competitive, a front weapon slot is strictly better than an aft slot. Cannon builds significantly value a 4 weapon slot as it allows them to equip an extra dual cannon. And beam builds prefer it too, for the following reason. The 4 quadrant is an essential part of the game. Most abilities, torpedoes, and consoles are biased towards the front 90 degrees of your ship. A lot of broadside builds have to do a wiggle maneuver to keep their enemy jumping between their broadside and their front arc. This is an annoying move that lowers damage as it takes enemies outside of your rear arc. Now let's get into, I think, the most important slide of this whole presentation. The damage potential. What is damage potential? It's the base DPS of a weapon for each slot, summed up. So the Vorgan Yeet-Jar, which we talked about earlier, is a 3-5 ship. This is the worst possible ship for cannons. And yet you can see it actually is slightly better set up for cannons than beams. It turns out dual cannons are quite good. Cannons do more base damage. You could see that every type of layout is better served by equipping cannons than broadsiding. You could also see that a 5-1 ship is equivalent to a 4-4 ship broadsiding. That's kind of crazy. I think most players would not expect that to be the case. One thing to keep in mind is that these values assume perfect piloting. Poor pilots will not see this be as 1-to-1. Two this community has many excellent pilots who are capable of reaching these values. Two things to consider here. There is a trait called broadside beam support. It's incredibly powerful, and it is designed to bridge the gap between cannons and broadsides. The other thing, that trait is more of a band-aid than a permanent solution. The other thing is that I want you to note that the broadside potential does not scale with the number of aft weapon slots. You can see every 8-weapon ship has the same potential, whether it's 3.5 or 5.3. And finally, note that using a set Omni Beam actually lowers your DPS potential because it does less damage. The fifth problem has to do with dual beam banks. This weapon type does not make a lot of sense. There's no natural aft counterpart outside of Omni Beams, and on ships with 3 aft weapons, you're kind of stuck having to put something else to put there. Now, DBBs feel natural on science builds, many of which have 3 afts and are designed around the front 90 degrees, which perfectly matches the weapon type. So it does not make a lot of sense that they have not seen a lot of success in that role. So taking all this together, I think the primary issue is that cannons are already better, so why limit beams? So you can see beams are weak, dual beam banks are weak, and just having those omni limits on top, it really feels like, dangling a bone in front of a sick dog. Like, we see the solution, it's kind of clear, but we just can't do it, why not give him the bone? And I think that's why, for 16 years, players have been asking for the same thing, because everyone comes to the same conclusion that it's kind of unnecessary. I think there's a fundamental game design issue where beams are not good enough, and the Omni equip limits just make it worse. And I think that is the primary reason players are asking for this change. It's not a case of wanting to fly a 4-4 ship with 4 Omnis in the back. It's players wanting to use item sets. It's players wanting to use dual beam banks. That is the real cause of the request. So how do we fix this? I think the first solution that should happen is improving aft slots. I want to talk about a really neat item, the Tempest Tail Gun. This is ancient. It's on one ship, and I don't even remember how it works, but as far as I know, it's the only aft-only weapon in the game, which is a very cool idea. I like tail guns. I think that's super cool, and I'd like to see that revisited. The other weapon I want to talk about is the narrow angle beam arrays off the Constitution 3. These have been incredibly successful. They do exactly what they're supposed to. Trade firing arc for additional damage. If we could combine these two items and make aft-only weapons that deal more damage than front weapons, we could create a situation where 4-4 is actually desirable. In fact, I'd like to see 4-4 ships become the premier broadsiders in this game, beating out 5-3. Let's move on. We really need a solution for ships with 3 aft slots. Right now, we have the kinetic cutting beam. Really, it's not good enough. Ultimately, it's beaten by a turret in a dedicated beam build. The damage bonus from being the same energy type overweighs the kinetic. It kind of clashes with the rest of the build, and while the 2-piece set effect has come back a little bit with the haste meta, it really is not good enough in endgame content or even mid-range content. One thing I'd like to see would be some science synergies, as the current modern science ships are science dreadnoughts and science spearheads, all of which have 4-3 seating. I think there's opportunity to do something neat, such as providing a aft-only weapon that increases science stats or perhaps scales with EPG. I think bringing in a third aft slot item for science might actually make dual beam banks good. Finally, beams need better set options, and let me tell you a bit as to why. Right here on screen, we have 2 item sets. The Ball Anti-Proton, which is very strong, and the Ancient Anti-Proton, also good. A player should expect to want to use both of these. They're both well worth using. However, if you're building beams, you cannot. Cannons don't have this restriction, and therefore, cannons are much more enjoyable to build. And also, cannons can run more item sets, including Omni Beam arrays, making better use of the single limit than dedicated beam builds. And there's plenty of good Omnis like the Pavon or the Morphogenic that are generic enough to be well worth running. So all in all, putting this together has really allowed me to gather my thoughts on this problem. And I'd like to propose a brief solution that I think would actually make a difference. My takeaway is that we should make Omnis suboptimal for broadsiding. I'd love to see some new aft-only beam arrays, perhaps limiting them to just your side arcs, so a limited range where you can't even shoot behind your ship. If they did the same damage as dual beam banks, they would actually scale with the aft slot more than the traditional beam arrays. Additionally, I think any such solution needs to be kind of a generic item, because if it's a one-off, it'll be ran, just the same on 4-4 ships or 5-3. We really need something we could stack multiple times. If we need to create some headroom to introduce more powerful broadsiding, I think we could look at reducing the power of broadside beam support, which I think is overtuned at this current time. Additionally, I'd like to see the Omni equip limit increased to 3. As part of this, I'd like to see Omni damage numbers standardized so players don't have to consult the wiki to see which one is in which category. Keeping the equip limit prevents 8 Omni builds and kind of encroaching on turret-only builds. It makes it much better for dual beam banks, but it doesn't really break the game by allowing 8 Omni builds. I don't think anyone wants that. This also increases beam set variety, enabling multiple item sets to be ran even on a beam build. This would greatly improve the set situation. So overall, I think this would give ships a better identity. We'd have 5-4 weapon ships. These ships would be naturally inclined towards cannons. We'd have 4-4 weapon ships. 4-4 would be the premier broadsider. 4-3 would use dual beam banks and Omnis, and 4-2 is very flexible, as is 5-2. For 3-4 weapons, we'd have dual beam banks and Omnis on 3-3, and a lot of side torp as well, I'm sure. And at 3-5, it's a natural mine layer, but also a great broadsider. I think this is a much better system than where it is now, where pretty much everything is a cannon ship, is best ran as a cannon ship. Thank you for listening, and, I think this gives every weapon type a home, except for single cannons, but we don't talk about them.